What would you do if you found out your neighbor was a killer, not just of one, but of hundreds? This is not a hypothetical scenario from a chilling horror movie. This was the grim reality for countless individuals in Indonesia during the mid-1960s. In the shadows of a turbulent political climate, an unthinkable atrocity took place. A series of mass killings swept across the nation, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The government, far from attempting to halt this reign of terror, encouraged it. Leaders of death squads were not only allowed to walk free, but were even urged to reenact their heinous crimes for the camera. A nation held hostage by fear, neighbors turned executioners, and a government that watched it all unfold. This was the landscape of Indonesia between 1965 and 1966. As we delve into this horrifying chapter of history, prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness. This is the terrifying reality that unfolded in Indonesia between 1965 and 1966. In 1965, a failed coup attempt sparked a deadly chain of events. September 30th, 1965. The day that would forever change the course of Indonesia's history. A group of rebellious military officials, unsatisfied with the existing regime, plotted what they believed would be a swift and decisive coup. Their targets were the high-ranking army generals, the very pillars of the Indonesian military establishment. But their plan was riddled with miscalculations and errors. The coup was swiftly thwarted. In its aftermath, the Indonesian government arrested the conspirators. 6 high-ranking army generals, once revered and feared, were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, their fate sealed by their own comrades. The failed coup, however, was much more than a botched power grab. It was the spark that ignited a terrifying inferno. The government, quick to seize the moment, used the failed coup as a pretext to commence a series of mass killings. The narrative was simple. The coup was not just a military rebellion, it was a conspiracy by the communists, a threat to the very fabric of Indonesian society. The government's response was brutal and uncompromising. They used the coup attempt to justify what would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. Overnight, Indonesia became a nation on the edge, its people living under the shadow of an impending bloodbath. The failed coup and the subsequent execution of the 6 generals acted as the catalyst for a horrifying spree of violence. It opened the floodgates for an unprecedented wave of state-sanctioned killings, a purge that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of Indonesians. The events of September 30th, 1965, serve as a grim reminder of how quickly a nation can spiral into chaos. A failed coup, 6 dead generals, and a nation on the brink of a bloodbath. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would shock the world. In the aftermath of the coup, a horrifying solution emerged. With the political landscape in turmoil, the Indonesian government sanctioned an extreme measure to quell the perceived threat of communism. This measure took the form of death squads, organized groups tasked with the systematic extermination of those suspected of communist leanings. These death squads were not covert operations hidden in the shadows. Quite the contrary, their existence was a widely acknowledged reality, a grim reminder of the government's determination to eliminate the so-called Red Menace. They were composed of military personnel, police officers, and even civilians, all unified under a chilling directive: to root out and eliminate communism by any means necessary. Their methods were brutal and unequivocal. Accusations were enough to seal a person's fate, often without the luxury of a trial or even the opportunity to defend oneself. These squads were judge, jury, and executioner, delivering a swift and often public demise to anyone they deemed a threat. The fear they instilled in the population was palpable. People lived in constant dread of being accused, knowing that such an accusation could lead to their end. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friends against friends, all in the name of self-preservation. The death squads did not just kill individuals, they tore apart communities, leaving a trail of paranoia and mistrust in their wake. Yet it wasn't just the fear of death that made these squads terrifying, it was the impunity with which they operated. With the government's blessing, they were above the law, their actions unchallenged and their atrocities unchecked. They were a horrifying manifestation of state-sanctioned violence, a grim testament to the lengths a government would go to maintain power. In a span of a few months, the death squads had become a terrifying force of destruction. Their birth marked a dark chapter in Indonesian history, a chapter where fear reigned supreme, and death was a constant looming threat. It was a time of unchecked violence and brutal suppression, a time when the act of killing became a horrific norm. The death squads once formed embarked on a merciless killing spree. In the shadows of the year 1965, the landscape of Indonesia was forever altered. The death squad's newly minted instruments of destruction unleashed a storm of violence that would scar the nation's history. In less than 2 years, they brought about a bloodbath of epic proportions. The scale of the killings was staggering. Every day and night the squads roamed the streets, their thirst for blood unquenchable. They targeted anyone suspected of being a communist, their judgment swift and unerring. There were no trials, no fair hearings, they served as judge, jury, and executioner, their verdicts etched in blood. The violence had an intensity that was chilling. The victims were not simply killed, they were brutally murdered. Men, women, even children, no one was spared. The death squads showed no mercy, their actions fueled by a fervor that was both terrifying and bewildering. Amid this reign of terror, the world remained silent. There were no international condemnations, no calls for intervention. The Western powers, preoccupied with their own Cold War anxieties, turned a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding in Indonesia. The United Nations, supposedly the guardian of global peace and security, was conspicuously silent. It was as if Indonesia had become an isolated island, its cries for help lost in the vastness of the international sea of indifference. The killing spree, in its relentless fury, lasted for more than a year. When the dust finally settled, the death toll was horrifying. An estimated 500,000 lives were extinguished in this brutal wave of violence. The death squads, having carried out their grim task, receded into the shadows, leaving behind a nation scarred by trauma and a legacy of fear. An estimated 500,000 lives were extinguished in this brutal wave of violence. In the aftermath of the killings, Indonesia was a nation forever scarred. A chilling silence fell over the country, the echoes of atrocities still ringing in its ears. The mass killings had ripped apart the social fabric of the country, leaving deep wounds that have yet to fully heal. The political landscape was drastically transformed. The government that had once encouraged these death squads now found itself sitting on a powder keg of tension and unrest. The perpetrators, who had once been hailed as heroes, were now embedded in the power structure of the country. The very individuals responsible for the bloodshed were now the ones tasked with leading the nation forward. The social impact was equally devastating. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed, and trust among neighbors shattered. The killings had not just claimed lives, but also the sense of unity and harmony that once defined Indonesian society. The fear and suspicion sown during that period persist to this day, casting long shadows over the nation's collective consciousness. Perhaps the most profound impact was on the psyche of the Indonesian people. The horror of the killings left a deep psychological scar, a wound that remains raw and tender. The trauma experienced by survivors and their families has been passed down through generations, a haunting reminder of the dark chapter in their history. Yet, despite the magnitude of these atrocities, justice has remained elusive for the victims. The perpetrators, some still wielding significant power, have largely evaded accountability. The cry for justice, once a deafening roar, has been reduced to a faint whisper, drowned out by the machinations of political expediency. The ghosts of the past still haunt Indonesia, a country still grappling with its bloody history. The silence that once fell over the nation has been replaced by a cacophony of voices, clamoring for justice, for acknowledgement, for healing. It's a country seeking to reconcile with its past, while struggling to navigate its future. So, what have we uncovered in this dark chapter of history? We've journeyed back to the mid-60s, where a failed coup in Indonesia triggered a horrifying reaction. A government, in a bid to seize control, sanctioned the formation of death squads. These groups, composed of civilians and military personnel alike, embarked on a chilling rampage across the nation. They extinguished tens of thousands of lives, if not more, in a ruthless killing spree. Innocent or guilty, it didn't matter. The purge was indiscriminate, relentless, and unforgiving. The aftermath, a nation left scarred, families torn apart, and justice elusive. We've witnessed the chilling reenactments of these brutal crimes by the very perpetrators, a spectacle that is as surreal as it is terrifying, a stark reminder of the depths to which fear, power, and propaganda can plunge a society into chaos. This is the chilling story of the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966, a grim reminder of humanity's capacity for violence.